Hello, everybody. It's good to see everyone back for this episode of the Rambling Reverend. And I struggled. This is my third time doing this video today because one, I got interrupted by a phone call. Then the second one, I was just sitting on it and I'm like, you know what? Didn't really say anything worth listening to. And so now I'm doing a third one. And I just want to point this out to everyone from a standpoint of just that total transparency and honesty is occasionally we fail at things, and failure isn't fun. It isn't easy to go through. And as a parent, I watch my kids and I watch them grow, and I am realizing more and more that we have to teach our kids to fail, and that there are bigger issues in life than whether or not you do something perfectly. So this was not the started purpose of why I wanted to do the video, but I want to just put it out there that occasionally failure is something that needs to happen. And actually a good example would be this last Sunday. I preached the 8:30 service, and I told David, I'm like, that was a D-. Like, that was a terrible sermon, I thought. The general point was kind of understood. The illustrations, the hook, and everything else was not really strong. And he's like, "You're beating yourself up. It wasn't a terrible sermon." He's like, "I've heard worse and I've preached worse." And I'm like, "Yeah, I have too, but it didn't set well." And so then I reworked and restarted the sermon for the 10:30 service, and it was so much better. And the goal of that sermon was to just point blank tell people that the Church of Jesus Christ, so God's church, not this church, but God's church, is not going to be squashed or ruined no matter where or what persecution is coming on top of it. Therefore, we must not be given into anxiety and fear and frustrations, no matter who's in office, whether we agree with them or disagree with them, and whether or not the current economic situation is favorable or unfavorable. And I talked about the illustrations both from the text, but then from life, about how the persecution that the church has gone through for the last 2,000 years in different iterations hasn't ruined it. And in fact, churches, if we're really honest, the gospel spreads most whenever it is in an environment where it's hostile. And this is an additional part, is because you really have to ask whether or not you're preaching the true gospel or a fluff gospel, if it can meet the current moment in time. And so you can tell if someone really believes something, whether or not they hold to it when things are good or bad. And so I had to be honest that I felt like the first sermon was a failure, and I reworked it. And the 10:30 sermon was much better. And so something that I wanted to talk, though, about is I was recently discussing with someone about the value of higher education, especially in regards to pastors, whether or not a pastor should have a seminary degree, or if it's necessary, or when they should do it. And so I thought I'd just talk a little bit about why I got a Master of Divinity, and the value I see in it and the value I don't see in it. And for the people who don't know me, I grew up inside of a Christian family. So I was the kid whose family went to church every Wednesday night, and then went to Sunday school, went to Sunday morning service, and went to the Sunday night service. And then after that, usually went to a midweek service, midweek program at Youth for Christ on top of that. And then another night of that week, I was helping with the other midweek program that Youth for Christ did. So I grew up inside the church, around church, inside of church gatherings. I'm the youngest of four boys. My dad has been a deacon or an elder at a church pretty much almost every year of his life since he was in college. Now, deacon and elder, financial secretary, like, those terms can mean a whole lot more and a whole lot less depending on your church context. And so this is not an argument about church governance and titles and terms. But it's to give you a background of who I am. And so when I applied for college, and this is part of the value of, this is coming out the end of February. So you have high school juniors and seniors who are thinking about college, who are applying to college. And so I want to talk to you about why I did my initial undergraduate schooling. So at 6 years old, I knew I wanted to be in ministry in some fashion or form. And in middle school, it switched from being, I know I'm going to be a Bible translator, to like, maybe I want to be a pastor at some point. And before then, I thought I was going to be in the Army, Navy, the Marines. I was going to do all these different things. And I was also going to be a professional basketball player. And that somehow was going to return to then being inside the ministry. I didn't consider, I guess, in middle school, that my college education would be in pastoral ministry, so to say. But college was almost never, or I should reword it, college was always assumed to be what a Murray boy would do. I don't think my parents meant to have that be, but they're both college graduates. And my oldest brother went to college. Then the next one after that, he went to college, but was also in the military, so then had deployments. And then the brother just older than me, he went to college, and I had most of my cousins attended college in some capacity. So like there was just this general understanding attending college. But I remember by the time I was a high schooler, I pretty much had given up any of the delusions of being a professional basketball player, was not going to join any of the armed forces. And so college at that point, I knew I was going to go to college to train to be in the ministry of some fashion. And even when you took those little tests in high school of what career field should you be in, it was being a pastor. So like there's no questions there. But I still held a strong affection for the city of Chicago in my heart when I was in college, or when I was in high school, because when I was a small child, the Chicago Bulls were amazing. They were legendary. The only thing that could compete with the 1990 Chicago Bulls would be the 1960s Celtics. Like the Bulls were just amazing. And unless you grew up in Michigan, then you hated them. But I was in Texas for the first part of the 90s, where the Mavericks were no longer good at that point. They were a young franchise. So I had half heard about the Dallas Mavericks, but my best friend his dad was from Chicago. Like they were from Chicago. So then because he was from Chicago, I cheered for Chicago. So then we moved to Michigan, 1997. The Bulls win another championship. I remember I had a notebook. Like I would cut out the newspaper articles and pictures of Michael Jordan, and I'd glue them to my spiral bound notebook. I had my Jordan collectible memorabilia memory notebook. And so I wanted to go to school in Chicago for some reason. Somehow it was in my brain, and I knew Wheaton College was in Chicago. And I looked at it, and it was like $25,000 a year in 2006. And I'm like, that is ridiculously expensive. I'm like, I don't know if I could afford to go to school all 4 years there. And my dad just offhandedly says, well, if you want to go to school in Chicago, look at Moody. We looked at Moody. I applied to Moody, and I think I applied to them early application in November that you'd find out in February. Rather than the second round of applications was due by February, and you'd find out over the summer. And it was a very intense application. There were multiple essays that you had to fill out. You had to have 3 different letters of references, basically all saying that you were called to ministry and fit for ministry, or fit to be prepared for ministry. And I then had a bunch of friends who were much better academically performing than I was. They took the ACT twice. They were scoring high 20s to low 30s, like multiple points higher than me on that. I graduated with a 3.78, I think it was, and then most of them were 3.9 or higher. And they applied to multiple schools. They were, they had the backup to the backup school where they're like, well, I want to study this, but so I'm applying to here, there, and another one. And I was like, there's just some sort of hubris that would go on for me to not apply to a second school if these higher performing peers of mine are applying to multiple schools that have a much larger student population and a much easier application process. So I went to Spring Arbor. So Spring Arbor University is a local, was a quote local Christian college, a local private college in the middle of Michigan, and I knew people who had ran there. My coach Ken Mills, he had ran there back in the 70s, and then his oldest son had ran there. David Taylor, who was in my brother Daniel's class, had run there, and I'm pretty sure Dante Otolini was the coach at that point, and they had some really good Kenyan runners who'd come through that program. And so I did the online process, did a couple of emails back and forth, and they offered me a scholarship to go there and run. And so then I had to decide which of the two colleges would I go to. So this is part of the meat of seminary and graduate school for folks. And I remember distinctly thinking, if I go to Spring Arbor, which is a fine liberal arts college, I am going to be running, so I'm not going to be as focused on education, and it's not as intense of school as Moody. So in order for me to be qualified or prepared to be a pastor, I'm going to have to go and get a master's degree after that. At that point, I didn't know the difference between Master of Divinity, Master of Arts, all that other stuff. I was just like, I'm going to have to get a master's degree afterwards. But if I go to Moody, then I'm really going to focus in, and they're really intense. They're really good. I'm going to be ready to be a pastor after 4 years there. I'll be ready for ministry. So then I decided to go to Moody. And my freshman year, I joined the basketball team. And I remember getting a not A in Old Testament introduction. And I was just like, oh my goodness, like this is not good. One of the worst grades I'd ever received in a class at that point. And I'm like, I'm one of the only people in this class who'd read the Bible multiple times prior to that class. And that being said, you could always argue you did the TA grade, the papers or whatever. Like I remember writing a paper freshman year at Moody that was just one paper for that class, was like 15 to 20 pages. And it was a longer paper than I remember at the end of 4 years, a friend who went to Central Michigan who got a degree in business. Like I wrote more in one paper in that class than he did in his entirety of his 4 years at college paper wise. And we had 4 of those papers in Old Testament and then 4 of those papers in New Testament. Like Moody was very intense with the number, all that stuff. So I was playing on the basketball. I was injured on the basketball team, sitting on the sidelines, and I realized like, hey, I came to Moody to study. I came here instead of going to Spring Arbor to study rather than do sports. So I realized like I should probably not continue on. And my brother Aaron had played soccer at Nyack as well as run cross country. And then Tim had ran cross country. And I was like, you know what? I know what it takes to be successful as a collegiate athlete. And I know that it's going to be 20 to 25 hours a week of actual work. So there's the hours of practice that you got to do, as well as the hours of lifting that you should do on top of that, as well as the hours of just shooting around and skill development. So I'm like, am I willing to put in 3 to 4 hours a day for the next 3 years to actually do this sport right? So then I decided after that not to do basketball, not to play anymore on the Moody basketball team. And I remember then thinking afterwards that like, well, I should switch my degree. Most people switch the degree multiple times, but I'm like, I realized that I was going to be a pastor. Like I wanted to be a pastor. I wanted to do rural ministry. And I went on a summer trip to Europe where is a really cool program where we studied while we were in Europe. And I finally decided that I should switch from being pastoral major to then, so everyone's dual Bible and something else. So it's Bible, pastoral ministry, and I changed the emphasis from to pre-seminary. And I changed it to that, not so that way I didn't plan on attending seminary after that, but I changed it so that way I could use more non-pastoral electives. I didn't want to take any more preaching classes than I had to. I wanted to take Bible classes. I enjoyed the electives of Bible being what applied to my necessary electives to get my the bachelor degree that I got. And so then I remember my senior year there at Moody talking to different colleges and seminaries. And I kind of was like, maybe I'll go back and I'll get an MA. And I applied to GRTS, I'm pretty sure that year, but I deferred for a year. I was like, I don't want to go right now, but the application. And I wasn't sure if I was going to study MA Old Testament because I really wanted to dig into the Old Testament because I feel like there's so many books of the Old Testament and so much knowledge that isn't there that we just operate on having ignorance. I'm like, I should dig into there. Or just thinking about how as a pastor we do so much counseling, I was like, maybe I'll get an MA in pastoral counseling. So like there was a MA counseling pastoral focus that GRTS had. And then it just so happened I was talking to someone during that year between Moody and going to seminary because I was like kind of had for some reason resolved the fact that maybe I'd go and I was going to take a year off and see if I needed to do seminary. And so I wasn't planning on it, but it was something that was a backup plan. During that year, I found out someone was like, well, you should just apply to this scholarship for the full Master of Divinity. And I was like, no, I don't want to, I kind of like, I argued with him about doing it and like, no, just do it. Like it. And I did, and I got it. And then I went to seminary. Now, all this to say, I think one of the issues whenever people think about any form of graduate degree is the biggest value of a graduate degree is knowing how you want to narrow your focus. So for me, I had already had a degree in Bible and pastoral ministry. So I knew I needed a year of just general experience to know, like, where's my deficit that I need to focus on intensely. But I think the same would apply for someone who's an engineer, someone who is any sort of field of study, a teacher or something else, where like, this is where I need to focus more on my education to better myself. Or this is where I really find my strengths. And so then I want to now redirect my career towards this specific goal. And I think there's a big issue whenever we discuss doing secondary education and doing graduate education. Any of the post-high school conversation is, are you just wanting to make more money, therefore you're getting a degree for more money? As a Christian, I don't think that should be a primary motivator. But if you think there is a deficit that you have, then maybe that is something that should be addressed. But as a community, we have a lot of tools that we need to be using to help direct people where they're going in college. So I remember having conversations with people about should they do sports in college. And they looked first and foremost at what schools were asking them to compete for them. And I was like, find the college that you find to feel like home and then see if they have it. Because collegiate athletics is fleeting. It's really cool. It's really special. But like, understand it takes a lot of time. And so you should want to be at the school that you're at if you're going to be that much focused on the athletics. Like, it's going to be 20 to 25 hours a week. So regrouping in, that's a lot of my story. I ended up getting a Master of Divinity, and I feel like it was a wonderful, amazing 4 years. There are multiple professors that I think incredibly high of. I named my oldest child after one of my professors in seminary. I recommend the book, multiple books from Dr. Whitmer, for just like I did last week. They're really well written and they're really digestible for folks. My Old Testament professors, Dr. Greer, he completely helped re-transform how I think about the Old Testament and how I approach the Old Testament from a just worldview and a viewpoint. And then Dr. Evans, who I barely had any of him at seminary, but just the few conversations I had with him there were genuinely transformative in how I approach others and how I approach ministry and just how I approach thinking. And so I needed seminary to become a man of God able to be in a pulpit. I wasn't ready to be a pastor after Moody. And now, is that more so a age and maturation issue rather than a knowledge and comprehension issue? Would I have been better suited to have spent 4 years being mentored by different men who could have maybe helped push me into different ways of understanding the Old Testament? I do know that there were some folks in Southwest Michigan, men who were getting their PhDs in anthropology that I know I could have gleaned a lot from. So like there's people who were around and available, but looking back in the rearview mirror, God wanted me at seminary. That's where I found my wife. That's where I discarded some of my old doctrines, and that's where I refined some of my doctrines. That's where I held on to some of my old doctrines more tightly. That's where I started to have a better understanding of translation and translation philosophy and which Bibles are better recommended for people at different education levels. So like all this stuff ends at the end of the day that the decision for higher education is something that's best done whenever you talk about it with other people. Never be afraid to take a year off between high school and college. Never be afraid to go to a junior college rather than the state school. Don't feel like you have to leave home, but also ask yourself the question why you aren't more willing to go further away from home whenever you're studying. The psychology behind why you choose a lot of things almost matters more than what you're doing, because these why questions push you a whole lot more than the what. So like looking back, should I have ran at Spring Arbor if I was going to get a Master of Divinity anyways? I mean, like that would have been a lot of fun. It would have been so much fun. I would have been able to run with Cameron Mills. I would have been able to run with Nathan Martin, who had been a rival at a other school. Like it would have been so different, so wildly different. Would I be dealing with the same nagging lower leg injuries from the training in basketball and the bad ankle sprain? I don't know. But I know that my time doing ministry in the urban setting of Chicago and building relationships with Pastor William Gates and knowing Stan Dial and knowing Kevin Taylor, aka CK, like the time with all the different guys on the dorm floor, the friendships developed there, Dr. Johnson with systematic theology, as well as the trip to Europe. Like, all these things wouldn't have happened. And so the what ifs really don't give us any answers, but rather looking back, we can see where God worked. And so if you're a high school junior or senior and you're looking at college, it's a big decision, but don't be so afraid. Like, trust that God has placed people in your life that can move you in the right direction. And then also, if you're a college junior or senior and you're wondering about should you do more college after that, my advice is, hey, don't be afraid to walk into the career that you're hoping to be and slowly wade into the waters of a further graduate degree. And then there's just my encouragement to everyone: be encouraging to people, treat people well, like be gracious, be compassionate. allow people to grow, because life is complicated and it's difficult. So this ended up being a 25-minute rambling rather than a 15-minute rambling, but I hope that looking at education through the lens of my experience gives some people some freedom, gives them something to relate to, and that at the end of the day, that it relieves some anxieties and fears that people have. And if you ever have any Bible or theology or other questions, don't be afraid to comment them below. Don't be afraid to email me. Don't be afraid to contact me. I'm here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Maumee, Ohio. Don't be afraid to stop by and ask questions. I cherish it, I relish it, and I love walking through life with people. So have a wonderful day.